Let me cut straight to the point and say we're going to be talking about grief in this episode. Though I'll try to crack jokes and make the subject lighthearted, there's only so much one can do when talking about grief and loss. I hope all of you enjoyed this episode and learned something for yourself or others, but if you're going through something, take a moment. I would be more appreciative if you know that this is not the best video for you right now and take care of yourself. Sometimes humor is not what we need for a person to cope. Let's take a moment for people to decide. And if you're still here, let's pick the mood back up by talking about loss of loved ones. Yay! Death is a part of life, but it doesn't make it easier when we're dealing with loss of a loved one. Grief sucks. Grief sucks, to put it mildly, and a family who knows that very well is the Crane family. Though I love the 90s sitcoms, I'm not talking about the Crane family from Frasier. Though if you want to see that episode, leave a comment below because I'd totally do it. No, we're talking about the family from the awesome Netflix show, The Haunting of Hill House. There is so much to unpack in that show, but grief is a staple of the show's theme. It's right up there with ghosts and family, so I'm not going to even be cute about this. There will be spoilers. With that said, let's go way back to the summer of 1992. Fuck, man, I'm old. Most people are like, wow, that's such a magical time ago, before the internet. And I'm like, I was 13. Anyway, Hugh and Olivia Crane bought an old-ass mansion that they planned to make shiny and pretty, then sell it off and make a bunch of money. Yes, flipping such a big house is hard, but like many good parents in the 90s, they would save cash by having their children be used as a workforce. Stephen, Shirley, Theo, Luke, and Eleanor were all the shittiest employees because they only wanted to spend their summer being kids. They are slackers. The kids experience all sorts of weird ghost shenanigans while their parents are working on the house.
You guys okay?
We're okay. It's all right.
With the statue.
It's all right, baby.
The caretakers, the Dudleys, help out the family as well. The Dudleys help watch the children. They also help with the renovations and tell them to just run, because the longer they stay in the house, the chances will increase that someone is going to, well, lose it and try to kill everyone. Of course, the Cranes do not listen, and of course, Olivia Crane finally succumbs to the ghost's influence and tries to kill her family. Like you do, the Cranes flee and Olivia dies in the house. This is where we find out that if you die in the house, you become a ghost in the house as well. Now, in present day, the Crane children have grown up and have developed their own wonderful issues after the haunting and after the death of their mother. To me, this is what the show is really about. The show is about how the children are molded by their fear, loss, and grief. Let's go ahead and dig into the loss and grief aspect of the Crane family, specifically the children. We are all going to experience grief in our lives at some point, be it a loved one dying or eating the last piece of bacon. In all fairness, if you love bacon as much as I do, a small amount of bereavement time is acceptable. Depending on the loss, we will all have our own way to grieve, and it will be very different from each and every single person in the world. One popular example of the process of grief is the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief. Now note, I said it was popular, not common. There is a reason why I say this, so remember that. It's important. The 5 stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Writer and director Mike Flanagan confirmed in a tweet that the 5 stages were reflected in the Crane children. Stephen being denial, Shirley anger, Theo bargaining, Luke depression, and Nell acceptance. Okay, Nell being acceptance has always bothered me a little bit just because she's dead. I mean, okay, she's accepting being dead, but if you're not dead, I don't know. That's just one always bothered me, because pretty much if you're a ghost in denial, you kind of need a ghost therapist. Ghost Therapist, my new 90s sitcom right after Frasier. But including Nell to some degree, I look at the interpretation and see it as a fairly accurate idea. But I do want to point out that with the Crane children, this is the personification of the 5 stages, not their current state of grief. So take that into consideration. If anything, this is more of the current moods that the Crane family are in, and not necessarily dealing with the grief of Olivia Crane or the people who died in Hill House. Besides grief, I've used terms like mourning and bereavement, so just to make sure we're all reading the same Ouija board, let's make sure we know what grief is, as well as bereavement and mourning. Grief is the emotional response to the loss, okay? We can grieve over the loss of a home, a job, a pet, or a psychotic mom trying to poison your ass. Those are all common examples, but there are so many more I can't even list them all if I tried. The expression of grief, however, is mourning. The time period of grief and mourning in general is called bereavement. So just to make sure, we feel grief, We express grief through mourning, and we do that for a time of bereavement, okay? Okay, so now let's look at the Crane family. Like all of us, we're influenced by our past experiences, good and bad. Shirley's choices to be a mortician or not being a cat person could easily have been influenced by her childhood, as well as Steve's fear of having children, or Theo being a child psychologist. But this doesn't necessarily mean that they are still in a time of bereavement. I would say that Steve and Shirley are pretty much done with mourning over the loss of their mother. There will be times where they miss her, of course. That's pretty normal. But they've moved on. Good for them. Sometimes people feel like they're dishonoring their loved ones if they continue on with their lives, or that the person who they lost loses some value if they don't mourn for a specific set of time. But that's just not the case. Countless cases show that people value the relationships that they have with the deceased and understand that they too are alive and must continue living. The two are not mutually exclusive from each other. Steve and Shirley are mostly done with the mourning of their mom. It will come back from time to time, of course, but they do not value their mother any less. It could be the same for the other children as well. Theo could be more trying to cope with the negative effects of being psychic than coping with the actual loss of her mother. And then there's Luke. And Luke, he's just trying his best, man. One key factor that makes grief, as well as most disorders, more difficult to deal with is the lack of social support that many people get. In many situations, a strong social support is a huge key factor in dealing with what many psychologists would call crappy things. Luke's family, with the exception of Nell, are not the most supportive bunch, with some exceptions like Nell's funeral. But for the most part, it's not until everything goes down in the show where we start seeing that turnaround. Once the children do come together, Luke does show more success with kicking addiction, and having his family help him more directly, as well as having some professional help, was probably a key factor in that. I would also say that the siblings look like they come together at the end of the show not only helps Luke with his addiction, but new losses as well. And speaking of new losses in their lives, let's talk about Nell. She is the one true character where we see grief in its truest form. With the horrors of Hill House, she was actually doing pretty good. Night terror sucked, to put it mildly, but she most definitely has good support through it by her husband, and by the looks of it, she was getting better. She seemed happy and well adjusted until major tragedy struck once again. Then you could say she got a little bent out of shape over it. My point here is that saying grief is messy and life doesn't make it any easier is a very mild way of putting it. It's not a seamless transition, it's not clear-cut, and life in general is too messy to be overly focused on trying to work through a playbook or something as rigid as 5 stages. This is why many psychologists in the field do not place high emphasis on the 5 stages of grief. This is not to say that many of us won't feel denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and hopefully at one point acceptance, but there is too much emphasis on the first 4 feelings and behaviors leading to acceptance. In this particular rigid order, it's just not how it works. Even the idea of bereavement is not a one and done thing. Special dates such as anniversaries, birthdays may cause a person to have a small time of bereavement. I mentioned this a little before, but when you're done mourning or feeling grief, it doesn't mean it won't happen again here and there. There's just not a step-by-step process for this type of thing, and the 5 stages are not the only way to process grief. The 5-stage model does not have strong or consistent scientific backing behind it either. Furthermore, the original work was more about an individual confronting their own death than dealing with the loss of somebody else. In essence, there's more of a popular significance to the 5 stages than an actual reality to it. Grief is tackled in so many ways, especially when you think about how many different types of losses there are. I did not grieve the same way and the same amount of time as I did for my mother as I did for finishing the last piece of bacon. To clarify, the bacon was a much shorter amount of time. I want to put that out there. Other factors do come up that makes grief a really tricky thing. Many people go through something called grief burnout. Grief is a very emotional and taxing thing, and sometimes it's just too much to be able to deal with, or anything else, like getting out of bed. That is when not just emotionally, but anything is too taxing for a person. Grief just took so much out of them that they don't have anything left to give. We all need to build our reserves to deal with what life has to throw at us, and that is why it's also important to point out that feeling grief 24/7 when adjusting to a loss, many people think it's necessary, but rarely is a good way to work through something like this. Extreme rumination is just a fancy way of saying that a person is thinking of causes, consequences, and aftermath of their loss so much and for so long that they can't move past it. Nell losing her husband is a really good example of this. She's ruminating so much over his death that she does pretty extreme things to find answers to the loss. Forcing your psychic sister to do some of her mojo is a pretty big breach of not only trust, but pretty uncaring of what could happen in this case to Theo psychologically if there was something there. Nell is definitely a good case for persistent complex bereavement disorder, or PCBD. PCBD is when a person is so focused on the loss and the death of a loved one, not only are they absolutely incapable of recovering from loss, but they may even have the desire to join the person. Diagnosis does require the bereavement to be regularly over a year plus, except for children, that's 6 months. And the grief has to be above normal. I just wanted to mention this to remind everyone that grief is a natural part of the healing process, but like many things, too much is very, very detrimental. If you guys want, we could go more in depth about PCBD in another episode. If that sounds something cool, please leave a comment below. And if you want me to, or if you have another idea for a character in mind, don't be afraid to ask. And while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this with anybody else who may be interested. What it all comes down to is that we will experience grief at one point or another. Though I'm not a licensed therapist and these videos are not primarily for education, but to be entertaining, this is the one where it's really hard to be overly funny about. Grief just flat out sucks. Watching loved ones go through it suck. This is part of the trade for being passionate or loving towards anything. You'll catch me pointing out that almost anything psychological is neither good or bad, but it has good and bad parts, and that's included in grief in this episode. But, though cliche, I am a firm believer that it's better than having an emotionless life. Do what you gotta do to process this loss when it comes into your own life. If you do, after time, the studies show eventually the negative feelings become more and more sparse, but a lot of the positives remain. So, go forth and enjoy what you love. Remember those good times, because what The Haunting of Hill House taught me is that even after loss, things remain and it doesn't have to be all bad. Enjoy the time with what you love, whatever that is. But when it's over, enjoy it then too. I hope to hear from you all next time, and be good not only to each other, but to yourself. Nope. Okay, hold on. I haven't actually talked to you guys about this, but I love this. Have you noticed that that there's a red door and there's a red room? Red room, red room. And as we all know, red room spelled backwards is Mordor. And, oh, holy shit. Okay, so, sorry, I'm spiraling here, but this is like pop culture amazingness. Okay, so we have a red room. Red room, red room. Red room spelled backwards is Mordor. And just like the red room, one cannot simply walk into Mordor. Hey. I'm sorry, that was so amazing to me and I just realized that now. That's fair, but come on.